latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. There's an interesting little 9-minute video put together by Kite and Key Media about sports gambling. Taking stock of sports gambling 7 years after a seminal Supreme Court decision in 2018 that opened up sports gambling to states other than Nevada, New Jersey. And now 40 states have some form of legalized sports gambling. And the question is the impact. Are we feeding addictions? We use this word addiction a lot. And I think some people use it interchangeably as actually a scientific term as well as just a colloquial term. Somebody is just a devotee of this or is spending an inordinate amount of time and so characterizes like they're addicted to it, but not necessarily meaning in a clinical sense. I mean, it turns out to be important in terms of making sure people understand what you're saying when you're talking about regulating a particular industry, including but not limited to social media and all the ink that has been spilled suggesting that social media addicts young people to being online, and it atomizes them, it isolates them, it creates anxiety, but they can't stop. They have an addiction. And the suggestion is, every suggestions like this have been made. Every like is a dopamine hit that feeds the addiction. Actually, there was a documentary about Facebook called The Social Dilemma a few years back that essentially had some within the inner sanctum at Facebook, now Meta, that were suggesting as much, that it's programmed to be addictive. Well, anyway, getting back to Kite and Key Media and this piece they did on sports betting, it's a pretty good little 9-minute watch. I don't necessarily draw all the conclusions they draw, but it's a good primer.
As of early 2025, 40 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized some form of sports gambling, with 34 of them allowing online betting. And to say business is booming is an understatement. In 2018, the year of that Supreme Court decision, total sports betting revenue in the United States was around $430 million. By 2023, it had reached over $11 billion. And by early 2024, the parent company of the popular sports betting site FanDuel had surpassed the actual real-world casinos of the Las Vegas Sands Corporation to become the most valuable gaming company in the country. That's one of the most important statistics for understanding the current state of sports gambling in America. But here's the other. According to polling from Pew, the proportion of Americans who think that legalized sports gambling is a good thing for the country is 8%. So how do we reconcile those two data points? How can it be that Americans are pouring more money than ever into legal sports gambling while being ambivalent at best and downright hostile at worst about its very existence? Well, a big part of the story is that all that money the gambling companies are bringing in is coming from a surprisingly small number of people. In fact, about 50% of their revenue comes from just 3% of gamblers. And that points to an uncomfortable truth about sports betting. This is a business model that depends on addiction. Now, to be clear, this is not to pass sweeping judgment on sports gambling. The vast majority of people who play just treat it as harmless entertainment and find it easy to walk away. Researchers found that the median gambler on a sports app deposits $136 over the course of 5 years, which isn't anyone's definition of a crisis. Hell, it's not even anyone's definition of fun. But if you're the kind of person who's prone to gambling problems, a population that's estimated to include over 10 million Americans, Having a virtual sportsbook in your pocket is a surefire recipe for disaster. And a lot of the arguments in favor of sports gambling rely on blurring the lines between those two groups.
Mm-hmm. And how sports betting feeds, these sports betting outfits feed the addiction. Again, the perspective of the authors of this piece.
A study of over 700,000 gamblers that tracked them for nearly 5 years found that less than 5% of them ended up withdrawing more money than they deposited, which, again, is probably not that big a deal for the casual gambler, but is a huge problem for the compulsive gambler, especially because these companies go to extreme lengths to keep the compulsive gambler hooked. In 2024, a New Jersey woman sued the sports betting site DraftKings after her husband lost over $940,000 of her family's money, some of it taken from their young children's savings accounts, over a 4-year period. Why was she blaming the site rather than her spendthrift husband? Because she alleges DraftKings was constantly trying to entice him with VIP status, free trips, and Apple products, despite the fact that they knew he was a problem gambler because, as part of that VIP status, company representatives were talking with him every day. And despite the company's official policy of making high-dollar bettors turn over financial records to prove they aren't overcommitting, they nevertheless ignored that he was at one point wagering more than 4 times as much as his annual salary of $175,000.
The whole topic area of addiction and what to do about it, particularly when it represents a small percentage of an overall population that sees, for example, in this case, gambling as a leisure activity, not an investment opportunity. For more on this, as it pertains to social media, because I think there's some analogies to be made, Chris Ferguson joins us, professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, author of Catastrophe, The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. Chris, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me on this morning. It's always great to be on.
Yeah. So this discussion of addiction, you take it up in a piece you wrote for Real Clear Investigations about TikTok and, by extension, social media, and argue basically the science that despite what you've read, dopamine is not why kids are spending a lot of time on TikTok or Instagram.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there's been this narrative that has developed over maybe the last 10 to 15 years, and this kind of like dopamine hit narrative, right? This idea that people are engaging in some activity, whether it's social media or video games or something else, and that is giving them this sort of dopamine hit or dopamine rush, and that is related in some way to them developing, an addiction or a supposed addiction. And I was really kind of curious about, what does the evidence base look like for that? And where did this narrative really come from? Because it's pretty new. I mean, it's really been around maybe 10 or 15 years. But, I really wanted to hammer out, what is the scientific basis, for this narrative that's evolved?
And so, I mean, how do you flesh this out? Because there's seems to me legitimate concern about screen time and not wanting your kid to be on TikTok 6 hours a day scrolling through videos. Even if the content is neutral to marginally beneficial, right. You still and so when you see that, if that's not an addiction, what is it? Yeah. And if it's not an addiction, how should we regulate it, even just privately?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I mean, of course, the first question is this a legitimate concern, right? So there's this general tendency, for, parents and grandparents, and I'm a parent myself, so I understand it, to kind of like look at what kids are doing for entertainment, in any given time period and think that it's stupid. You know what I mean? That it's just a waste of time.
Yeah, right. Of course.
You can literally look back to the 1940s and you can find science papers written in real science journals about radio addiction, which maybe is a problem for some of your listeners. Who knows,
I hope so.
Yeah.
We're working as hard as the sports gambling people to try and addict people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we have to be aware that there's this kind of general tendency for, adults, middle-aged or older adults in particular, to think that kids really could be doing something better with their time, right? And that's just sort of a normal thing, parents and grandparents do. And that doesn't mean that it's a legitimate medical concern, so we really want to kind of differentiate between what is just, old people being old people versus, a concern that we really, have, about kids. And it really does come down to this issue. What do we mean by addiction? And it turns out simply your kid playing, video games, X number of hours a day doesn't mean that they have an addiction. There really are certain specific criteria that we look for. And I think for parents, understanding that in many cases can help a lot of parents feel better, that their kids maybe are wasting time, but that's okay. But also for some parents to help identify, well, maybe my kid does need some help. And that might not have to do, maybe it's not the video game or the social media that did it to them, but maybe their overuse of screens is a sign that they have other problems with, say, depression or anxiety that I really should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously studies that talk that have found dopamine spikes after someone takes a stimulant, right? I mean that
absolutely, yeah.
That literally creates a dopamine hit, but there's not evidence I'm taking from your investigation that there are elevated dopamine levels from scrolling through Instagram for hours on end.
Yeah, basically, first it's important to understand that dopamine is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter in our brains. It does lots of different things, and one of those things happens to be the sort of anticipatory pleasure is what we call it. So it's kind of like when you're waiting in line at Disney World, and you're waiting to get on the roller coaster, assuming you like roller coasters, or like the day before Christmas, like, how giddy kids get when they're anticipating something. So it kind of gives us that feeling. That's the sense of excitement that, is involved with these dopamine systems. And it's very normal. It's very natural. We want this to happen. I mean, this is, a part of the fun of life. What happens when we engage in fun activities is, of course, we see a slight elevation, in this kind of like background dopamine. So if you're eating a pizza or, reading a good book or playing a video game or using social media or listening to your beloved, morning radio show, you're experiencing an increase in dopamine of about 50 to 100% above the sort of baseline. What happens when you use cocaine or methamphetamine? Methamphetamine is classic because that elevates dopamine levels 1,300% above baseline. So apparently methamphetamine is very, very fun. Again, it's also very, very damaging. So I'm obviously not encouraging people to try it. So this is, I think, where this narrative came from. There's this kernel of truth that, pleasant activities do result in this slight elevation in dopamine by about 50 or 100%, whereas things like cocaine or methamphetamine also involve dopamine. So I think that's kind of like the kernel of truth, but they elevate dopamine by a massive amount. And they also are directly chemically involving the brain, and using these drugs can cause permanent damage to these dopaminergic systems. That it's not possible for video games or social media or radio to do that. And so that's why you end up with people with these substance abuse addictions that are always kind of chasing. They're no longer even trying to get high in some cases, but they're just trying to stay normal because of the sort of long-term, possibly permanent damage that's done to the dopamine systems.
And with social media, being on scrolling through TikTok videos for 6 hours is no different than when I was growing up, being in the driveway shooting hoops for 6 hours because that's what I really like to do.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So, I mean, some people say like, okay, well, you don't eat pizza for 8 hours a day. Well, hopefully we don't. Maybe sometimes we do, but absolutely there are other activities that we want kids to go, like the summer camp. We want them to hang out for a day with their friends. This sort of stuff. All of those activities release dopamine in exactly the same way. There's nothing really uniquely different about, social media or video games, or the radio, or reading books. People used to worry about reading books the same way they worry about social media today. So all these other activities are, very, very normal. They don't cause these like really permanent brain changes that you see from substance abuse. Now, you do see sometimes people overdo these activities, and that's true for almost everything. I mean, you can see people overdo religion, overdo work, exercise, There are research papers on dance addiction, on fishing addiction. There are cat hoarders out there. People overdo lots of different things. And so I think the real issue is not that, for people that are struggling, that there's something about the thing, whether it's technology or something else that is uniquely bad, but rather that you have this subset of individuals that seem to really struggle to moderate, pleasant activities, whatever those activities are. And, and in the clip you played about the gambling, that seems to be pretty consistent with that. You get about that 1% to 3% of people that really just sort of naturally struggle to moderate their behavior, and it might be gambling, which can have a lot of negative impacts, as we heard, or it could be another activity. And even sometimes you take one away, they just move from one. We're going to use this term addiction. One addiction to another one, and it still is damaging for them.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the commentary about social media too is it's conflated, right? I mean, it presents as clinical, but it's really like socio-political or socio-cultural commentary. Like, for example, Jonathan Haidt, who said this about social media platforms. They quote, "Dissolve the mortar of trust, belief in institutions, and shared stories that had a large and diverse secular held a large and diverse secular democracy in America together." I mean, that's a pretty big indictment. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's done all that. It's sort of just an instrumentality of the human condition. It seems to me more. But I mean, but that's really a commentary. That is maybe you think about children's use of or young people's use of social media, but you have this conception in mind of what social media is doing to the larger social fabric. And so you want to intercede because it's only going to get worse if what I think the social media platforms have already done is going to be multiplied exponentially by young people coming up using it even more than, Gen Xers.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting in the quote you just mentioned is, and you see this quite a bit in these dialogues about social media, it's this kind of like nostalgic utopianism, right? There's the grand past that we've lost and that somehow we need to get, back to. I mean, this idea that this social fabric of the U.S. I mean, we fought a civil war without social media. You know what I mean? It's like, we had segregation without social media. You know what I mean? So, and then you hear people talk about like, in the 70s, we used to just get together in the playground with our friends and hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Yeah, nobody ever called people names until social media came
I
around.
grew up in the 70s and 80s. That wasn't my experience. But also it's important that generation that everybody's, nostalgic about that 70s and 80s, which is my generation. I mean, that's when I grew up. They were the worst on record. They had the highest violent crime rate, drug use, alcohol use, smoking. They dropped out of school more than anybody else. Teen pregnancy was through the roof. Suicide actually was through the roof. They were horrible. We were horrible, and it's funny to see people like, we should go back to the 70s and 80s. It was like the worst generation of kids on record. But today's kids are actually doing pretty good for the most part.
Well, I mean, Freaks and Geeks wasn't exactly a documentary. I agree with you, but but now the flip side is to say, I mean, and part of this was everything bad was exacerbated during COVID, but there were some studies that suggested higher incidence of anxiety, higher instances of suicidal ideation. I remember talking about this before COVID, and a lot of it was because of the more intense environment that social media creates and sticks with you, different than the playground from a bygone era.
Yeah, we don't really see much evidence, for that. I mean, so, if you look at studies collectively, obviously some studies find effects, some studies don't. But if you look at them kind of together in meta-analyses, you overall find that like time spent on social media is actually not a good indicator of like anxiety or depression or suicidality or things like that. Usually where kids are having difficulties are from two sources. One of those, unfortunately, is their own families. So kids that have a lot of what we call these adverse childhood events, which can be like, abuse, of course, but also, if mom or dad committed suicide or mom or dad is incarcerated, or these sorts of things. And the other is schools. So, the kids have been trying to tell us for years, if you look at like surveys of kids, about 70 to 80% will say that schools are a toxic mixture of boring and stressful. Really, if you look at like what sorts of things, predict youth depression, for instance, the first one is just what's going on in their families. And it's important to recognize that, suicide rates among middle-aged adults are actually, many times higher than they are among teenagers. We tend to think of teenagers as being this high suicide, cluster. In fact, middle-aged men, sort of, men in my age category, and this isn't a cry for help, by the way, but, men in my category are about 3 to 5 times more likely to kill themselves than a teenage girl, for instance. And so a lot of what you see in terms of like when kids are suicidal, oftentimes it's because they've experienced a suicide in their family, or their parents are chronically mentally ill, or there's some other kinds of stressors that are going on. So I think part of the problem that we've had with social media is we've looked at kids in isolation rather than looking at the sense of like, well, suicide in the U.S. has gone up for everybody, and it's actually gone up more rapidly and more dramatically in middle-aged adults than it has in teenagers. And by contrast, we're not seeing that pattern in other countries. Teen suicide has stayed fairly static, across the world during the social media age. So we have a very specific U.S. problem, and it's not one that's localized specifically in teenagers.
He is Chris Ferguson. He's a professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, author of Catastrophe, the Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. Catastrophe is the name of Professor Ferguson's book. And do check out his piece, Addiction Fiction, Dopamine is Not Why Kids Love TikTok, at realclearinvestigations.com. Chris Ferguson, thanks as always. Appreciate your time.
Always great being on. Have a good day.
You too. And Chris Ferguson joined us on the Turnkey.Pro Answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Your show keeps me alive during the week. There's nobody I'd rather listen to between 5 and 9 in the morning than you guys.
On AM 560, The Answer.